Hey everyone, Tactics here, taking a look at how all of the different tank specs are doing in Shadowlands Season 1 raids and Mythic Plus. This video takes into account all of the tuning changes that have happened over the past several weeks, including the large set of changes that came with Mythic Castle Nathria. I also have similar videos for both DPS and healers, which you can find on my channel or linked in the description below. As with my previous videos, I do want to add a brief disclaimer. Remember that this video will be looking at how these specs are doing in Mythic raiding as well as high level Mythic Plus keys and holds less weight for low level difficulties. Overall, tank balance is by far the best out of any role in the game, with any tank spec being more than capable of completing every form of content. If your goal is to do things like get ahead of the curve or just complete Keystone Master, I would 100% recommend you play the spec that you enjoy the most. With that finished, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe for more Warcraft content, and let's start by looking at our B tier tanks in Mythic Castle Nathria. To start off, I think it's important to talk a little bit about tanks and raids. In particular, the fact that your tank choice, at least in higher end Mythic guilds, is almost always based on their raid utility exclusively and what their group is lacking. This means that the raid ranking of tanks can fluctuate depending on how good other specs of their class are doing, as you'll see in this list. Again, this doesn't mean the tank spec is bad, as tank balance is certainly the best balanced aspect of the game. It just means higher end guilds, which are more likely to play Flavor of the Month TPS specs, will likely use similar tank specs to fill any utility void. That brings us to our B tier tanks, where we'll start with Protection Paladins, whose biggest weakness is their squishiness compared to other tank specs. Once they're able to outgear content, this will be less of a problem, but early on when you're on par or even slightly undergeared, being a Paladin in Mythic raids can be very scary. They do pump when it comes to damage, being the highest overall damage tank spec in the game, and they also bring some solid utility with things like a Bubble, Freedom, and of course the raid buff and Devotion Aura. The problem, however, is that Ret and Holy are both in decent spots, making it difficult to justify bringing a much less durable tank in order to get the same utility. Joining Paladins in the B tier, we have Brewmaster Monks, who surprisingly also have similar problems with the lack of tankiness, contrary to how they've been in the past. While Brewmasters still smooth their damage taken and spread it out over time, their overall damage intake is quite high, putting them alongside Paladins as one of the squishiest overall tanks right now in raids. Their damage is still quite good, putting them on the higher end of tank specs, and they bring extremely important Mystic Touch debuff, which is a mandatory buff for high-end Mythic raiding. Unfortunately for Brewmasters, Windwalkers are doing extremely well at the moment, both in terms of their damage and their durability, and since you only need one monk to bring this debuff, the big upside of Brewmasters gets reduced to 0 when a Windwalker is also in the raid. Rounding out the B tier, we have Guardian Druids, who do not have the same problem of being squishy like Paladins and Monks, thanks to their fantastical physical damage mitigation and multiple damage reduction cooldowns. They are definitely on the lower end when it comes to tank damage, however on pure single target they are able to use the Draft of Deep Focus legendary to put out something respectable. When it comes to utility, Bears are definitely lacking, only really bringing Stampeding Roar, which is a great utility spell and important on several fights, but never mandatory like the Paladin or Monk buff, and can also be brought by Boomkins, who are in a very good spot right now in Mythic raids. With the B tier done, let's move on to the A tier, where we have Blood Death Knights. As I've mentioned in previous videos, Blood DK's mitigation is absolutely made for raids, where the damage intake is much more predictable than dungeons, and they usually have some time to ramp up. This makes them extremely durable in pretty much every raid fight with the exception of something like Sludge Fist, which gives them a lot of value over the B tier tanks. Their damage is lacking, being the worst of all the tank specs, but their utility definitely makes up for this, with AMS being usable throughout the raid to assist with several mechanics, and of course the return of AMZ as a raid-wide magic damage reduction. The problem with this is that Unholy is absolutely insane at the moment, and with many Mythic guilds having spots for several in their raid, additional AMZs start to lose a bit of value, especially once you start having more than 4. To finish off the A tier, we have Protection Warriors, which I'm sure will surprise quite a few people. I think they've gotten an unwarranted bad reputation with their Shadowlands adjustments, especially because they were significant nerfs, but overall, Prot Warriors aren't in a terrible spot. Mitigation and damage wise, I'd say they're middle of the pack overall, though they are significantly better against physical damage than magic and bleeds. They also have access to Spell Reflect, which can cheese several boss abilities, including on Denathrius. When it comes to utility, they also have a raid-wide cooldown in Rallying Cry, and of course the attack power buff in Battle Shout. Unlike some of the other tank specs, the other warrior specs aren't in a great spot at the moment. Fury isn't doing great and likely won't be played much, and Arms is situational, being very good on some fights and not so great on others. This makes Prot a reliable source of the attack power buff, and even if your guild already has an arms warrior, having an additional raid cooldown that isn't tied to a specific area is always a nice addition. And that leaves us with just one tank in the S tier with Vengeance Demon Hunters. Their biggest weakness in the past has been their large gaps in mitigation, resulting in them feeling quite vulnerable in higher end mythic content. This is now much improved in Shadowlands thanks to the new baseline cooldowns combined with the Fiery Soul legendary, giving Vengeance a lot of tools to work with and helping them to fill in their gaps. On top of this, they also bring some of the strongest tank damage just behind Paladins, and just like Brewmasters, bring an important raid debuff in Chaos Brand. A big benefit of Vengeance right now is that Havoc is kind of mediocre when it comes to DPS specs, which makes having one of your tank's Vengeance Demon Hunter much more valuable, as it allows you to bring a better spec in that otherwise mandatory DPS slot. In general, Vengeance is just great all around right now, and the state of Havoc pushes them up to the S tier for raids. With the raid rankings done, we move on to Mythic Plus, which works a bit differently. Since you only have 5 people in your group, not only is it impossible to cover all the available buffs and debuffs, it also gives a lot less overall benefit. This means things like damage output, durability, and kiting ability are a lot more relevant than just pure utility, though it still has value. To start things off, we have Blood Death Knights, who tend to struggle in dungeon content where damage is constant and spikes can be unpredictable. In situations like this, relying on your self-healing to live can be extremely scary, making Death Knights feel considerably squishier in dungeons than in raids. What they do have is great mob control, with single target and AoE grips, Chains of Ice, and of course their big AoE slow and Grip of the Dead. They are also in a much better spot when it comes to AoE snap threat, thanks to the Venthyr Covenant ability Swarming Mists, which they can alternate with Bone Storm to put out decent damage and keep threat on bigger pulls. Despite this new tool, their damage is still on the bottom end of tanks, which combined with their frailty leaves them down in the B tier. Alongside Death Knights, we have Protection Warriors, who are definitely feeling a lot worse than they did in BFA after a slew of nerfs and the talent rearrangements. While they aren't in a terrible spot at the moment with fantastic physical damage mitigation, they are weak to bleeds and magic damage, in addition to having some gaps in their mitigation due to the lower gear levels. Luckily, they have decent kiting ability thanks to Heroic Leap and Intervene, allowing them to quickly get out of some bad situations that occur from this. They also bring Battle Shout, which can be great if your group has strong physical DPS like Unholy DKs, Windwalker Monks, or Marksmanship Hunters, but loses value if you have casters. An AoE stun and Shockwave is also nice to have, and something most tanks don't have in their kit. Overall, Warriors are fairly average when it comes to damage output and survivability, and slightly lacking when it comes to utility. They are definitely a spec to keep an eye on for future tiers, as they are notorious for scaling well over the course of an expansion, but for now they're down in the B tier. Moving up into the A tier, we find Protection Paladins. They absolutely tear up the damage meters in 5-man content, however the price for this is them being one of the squishiest dungeon tanks alongside Blood Death Knights, which can make pushing higher keys, especially when under-geared, quite difficult. They also don't have the greatest mobility, making them reliant on their party members to kite effectively. With their great damage, they do bring a ton of useful utility with things like bubbles, freedom, strong off-healing, and a ton of extra interrupts with thanks to their Avenger's Shield, which can be especially useful with the ranged DPS meta that is currently forming. In general, Paladins are a strong offensive option, and while this is great for mid-level keys, once you start moving up in key level, their squishiness begins to outweigh their high damage output, leaving them on the lower end of the A tier. Then we've got Guardian Druids, who, as mentioned in the raid section, are exceptionally tanky, especially when using the Natural Order's Will for higher key levels. Unlike in raids, however, Druids have great dungeon utility, with mob control spells like Typhoon, Ursul's Vortex, and Mass Entangle, a Battle Res, an Enraged Dispel, and of course a party-wide speed boost in Stampeding Roar. Combine all these tools with their durability, and bears are able to pull off some significant pulls that would otherwise melt some of our previously mentioned tanks, then kite safely without the assistance of their party. While they don't have anywhere near the damage output of something like Paladin tanks, their damage isn't terrible, and their ability to do big pulls more than makes up for said lower damage. I think this strength could also come into play later on in this tier as people begin to push higher and higher key levels, but for now, bears are solidly in the A tier. Concluding our A tier, we have Brewmaster Monks, who are above average in most aspects compared to other tank specs. Their damage is quite strong, third best among tanks, and their durability is much better than specs like Paladins and Blood Death Knights thanks to the smoothing of stagger. They also have insane mobility, allowing them to kite quite effectively with things like Roll, Tiger's Lust, and Transcendence. On top of this, they bring some strong utility with Ring of Peace, Leg Sweep, and the physical damage debuff Mystic Touch, which is fantastic when paired along strong physical classes like Hunters. Their biggest weakness is their lack of self-sustain, making them very reliant on their healer, but with specs like Resto Shaman and Druid in a good spot right now, this usually isn't too big of an issue. And that means, just like in raids, Vengeance Demon Hunters are on top in Mythic Plus. Not only are Demon Hunters top 2 when it comes to damage, they are also near the top when it comes to durability thanks to their plethora of short cooldown abilities and strong self-healing. A big reason for their high damage is due to the Kyrian ability Elysian Decree, which allows for some insane burst AoE, enabling Demon Hunters to kite shortly afterwards while maintaining aggro. Speaking of kiting, Infernal Strike is insanely good for this, combined with things like Sigil of Chains for mob grouping and an AoE Disorient and Sigil of Misery to slow packs down. Their utility doesn't end there though, as they also have an AoE Silence and Sigil of Silence, Imprison which enables several small skips, a Purge, and of course Chaos Brand to buff some of the strong magic damage dealers right now, such as Fire Mage and Boomkins. Overall, Demon Hunters are just the full package right now, with high damage, solid durability, and top kiting ability, making them hands down the best tank spec in 5-man content. But that wraps up tank rankings for Shadowlands Season 1 Raids and Mythic Plus. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe for more content like it. If you're interested in my other spec rankings or guides to Castle Nathria and Mythic Plus Prideful routes, you can check them out on my channel. I'm also working on more in-depth Keystone Master guides to every dungeon, so keep an eye out for those. If you want to keep up to date with me, you can follow me on Twitter or check me out on Twitch, both at Tactics. But that's it for me, so thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.